You are standing in a long row of boys, and you are trying very hard to look like a man. It is hot, the kind of wet, heavy heat that sits on your shoulders, and the grass of the Great Plain runs flat and green to a line of low trees far away. There is a musket in your hands that is nearly as tall as you are, and your feet are bare because there were not enough boots and there were not enough men, so they came for the boys, and here you are. You are 12 years old, maybe 13. Somewhere down the line, an older soldier, a man with a gray mustache and a fresh false beard painted on with charcoal, so that from a distance the enemy will think the army is bigger and older than it is, tells you to stand still and stop shaking. You are not cold. You are shaking because across that green plain beyond the trees is the largest army your country's enemies have ever put into the field, and everyone around you, even the men, has the same thin look on their face. You do not think of yourself as part of some great question of history. You think about your mother and the river and whether there will be food tonight. You have been told over and over that your president is the greatest man in the world, that your country is the finest and freest on the continent, and that these invaders have come to swallow it whole and put you in chains. Some of that is true. Some of it is not. You have no way to sort the one from the other. And it does not matter anyway because the drums have started and the line is moving, and you are moving with it. And here is the thing you cannot know, standing barefoot in that grass with your painted, bearded neighbors. You are near the beginning of the bloodiest war this continent has ever seen, and by the time it is over, most of the boys and men in this line, and most of the boys and men in your whole country will be dead. Not some, most. Sit with me a moment, my friend, because I have to tell you about this one carefully, and I have to tell you honestly, and that is going to matter more in this story than in almost any other I know. My name is Joaquim. I taught the history of Brazil to school children for the better part of 40 years, and there is a lesson I always came to with a kind of dread, because it is the one where I have to talk about the worst thing that ever happened between the countries of South America. We call it the War of the Triple Alliance. In Brazil, we often just call it the Paraguayan War, and it is, by most reckonings, the deadliest war this continent has ever fought. Now, why the dread? Because this is a war where almost nothing is simple, and where the numbers at the end are so terrible that people have been arguing about them, in good faith and in bad faith, for 150 years. There is a version where the villain is a mad little tyrant who marched his own people into the grave. There is a version where the villain is a pair of huge empires, egged on by foreign money, crushing a small, proud nation that dared to be independent. Both of those versions have been shouted very loudly. Neither of them, I think, is the whole truth. And part of my job today is to walk you between them and show you where each one is standing on solid ground and where each one is standing on air. So let us go back to the plains and the rivers, and to a country you may never have thought about, and to how a quarrel over a small neighbor turned into a catastrophe. Start with the country because you cannot understand the war without it. Paraguay, in the middle of the 1860s, was a strange and singular place. It is landlocked, tucked into the heart of the continent, its life strung along its great rivers, because those rivers were its only real road out to the wider world. After it broke free from Spain, it had been ruled by a line of strongmen who kept it closed, tight, and turned inward, suspicious of its giant neighbors, proud of standing on its own feet, with the state controlling a great deal of the country's land and trade. And it worked after a fashion. By the standards of the region, Paraguay was orderly and self-sufficient. It fed itself. It had forts and foundries and a telegraph and the beginnings of a railway. Now, here already the arguments begin, and I will flag them as I go, because this is the honest way to teach it. Some tellers will paint you a picture of Paraguay as a kind of shining experiment, the most advanced and equal nation in South America, a threat to the great powers precisely because it proved a country could prosper without bowing to foreign banks. Others will tell you that is a romantic exaggeration, that it was a closed, controlled place run by one family. The truth sits somewhere in the honest middle, and you should be suspicious of anyone who tells it to you with total confidence in either direction. At the head of this country by the early 1860s was Francisco Solano Lopez. He had inherited power from his father. He had traveled in Europe, admired its armies, and come home with big ideas about his country's place in the world. And this is the man at the center of everything that follows, the man the whole argument of this war finally circles back to. Was he a far-sighted patriot defending his nation? Was he a vain, dangerous dreamer who mistook his own ambition for his country's destiny? Hold that question. We are going to need it at the end. Now, how does it start? Not at first with Paraguay at all. It starts next door, in little Uruguay. Uruguay in those years was torn between two political factions, two parties that had been fighting each other on and off for a generation, and their quarrel kept pulling in the giants on either side. Brazil to the north and Argentina to the west. Each had their favorites in Uruguay's endless feud, because whoever controlled that small country sat astride the mouth of the great river system that everyone in the region depended on. And in 1864, Brazil decided it had had enough of the faction in power in Uruguay, and it intervened. It put its weight, and eventually its soldiers, behind the other side, to force a change of government in Montevideo. To Brazil, this was a regional police action, tidying up a troublesome little neighbor. But to Solano Lopez, watching from Paraguay, it looked like something far more alarming. It looked like the balance of the whole region tipping. If Brazil could simply reach into Uruguay and install the government it wanted, then the two great powers, Brazil and Argentina, were free to arrange the heart of the continent to suit themselves. And a small independent country like Paraguay could find itself surrounded, boxed in, and slowly squeezed. So Lopez drew a line. He warned Brazil that intervening in Uruguay would be treated as an attack on the balance of the region. Brazil, far bigger, did not take the warning of the small inland republic very seriously, and Brazil went ahead. And then Lopez did the thing that turned a warning into a war. In November of 1864, a Brazilian river steamer called the Marques de Olinda came up the Paraguay River, going about its business, carrying among its passengers a Brazilian official, the newly appointed head of the distant Brazilian province of Mato Grosso. And Lopez had it seized. He took the ship, he took the official, and with that single act in a time of supposed peace, he lit the fuse. Right on the heels of that, Paraguayan forces struck north into Brazilian territory, into the sprawling, thinly held frontier province of Mato Grosso. And at first it went well for them. Mato Grosso was enormous, remote, and barely defended, the far edge of the Brazilian Empire, weeks and weeks of travel from the centers of power. The Paraguayans overran forts and towns, seized weapons and supplies, and for a while the opening move looked like a success. But look at the map, and you see Lopez's problem, the one that will define the whole war. His real enemy, Brazil, was mostly to his south and east, along with Brazil's Uruguayan allies. To get at them, to bring his army to bear where it counted, he could not go through the trackless wilderness of Mato Grosso. He needed to march south. And to march south, his army had to pass through a corner of Argentina, through the province of Corrientes. So Lopez asked Argentina for permission to move his troops across its territory. And Argentina, which was trying, at least officially, to stay out of the whole affair, said no. And this is one of those hinges of history where you can feel the whole future swing on a single decision. Because Lopez, denied his passage, did not stop and reconsider. He declared war on Argentina too, and sent his army into the Argentine province of Corrientes anyway. Think about what he had just done. A moment before, Paraguay had a war with Brazil, and Argentina was on the sidelines, uneasy and neutral. Now, with one stroke, Lopez had turned neutral Argentina into an enemy. He had taken a country that was staying out of his fight and given it a reason to march against him. And so the alliance that gives this war its name came together, out of that blunder. In May of 1865, Brazil, Argentina, and the new government of Uruguay, the one Brazil had just helped put in power, signed a treaty binding themselves together against Paraguay. The Treaty of the Triple Alliance, 3 countries formally allied to make war on one. Now, the terms of this treaty were supposed to be secret, and here is where the story gets its first real twist, the kind that changes how people would feel about the whole war ever after. Because within about a year those secret terms were leaked and published, printed, of all places, in Britain, and they caused an uproar. The treaty did not just say the Allies would fight until they had beaten Paraguay. It laid out what they meant to do afterwards. It set war aims that included removing Lopez from power. It carved up territory, spelling out lands that Brazil and Argentina would take from Paraguay when it was over. And it arranged that Paraguay, the defeated country, would be made to pay the costs of the war waged against it. When the world read those terms, a lot of people who had assumed the 3 big countries were nobly defending themselves suddenly saw something uglier. 3 governments coldly dividing up a small nation before it had even been beaten. And that document, that leaked treaty, became a weapon. It became the great piece of evidence for everyone who wanted to argue that this was never really self-defense at all, but a planned dismemberment. I want you to notice something important here, though, and it is the kind of thing a good history teacher has to keep saying. A greedy peace treaty at the end does not, by itself, tell you who was to blame at the beginning. Both of those things can be true at once. That Lopez started the war with his own aggression, and that his enemies wrote themselves a greedy bargain to end it. History is very rarely a story with one clean villain, and this war least of all. So now 3 countries are at war with Paraguay, and the fighting settles into a shape. And that shape is decided more than anywhere, on the water. Remember, Paraguay is an inland country that lives and breathes through its rivers. Those rivers are how it moves its army, feeds its forts, and touches the outside world. Cut the rivers, and you begin to strangle the whole country. And in June of 1865, that is exactly what began to happen, at a bend in the Paraná River called Riachuelo. The Paraguayan Navy came down to try to break the Brazilian fleet and keep the rivers open. And in a long, hard day of fighting, the Brazilian Navy broke them instead. Riachuelo was the decisive naval battle of the war, and its consequences ran through everything that came after. From that day, the Allies, and above all the Brazilian Navy, held the rivers. Paraguay's brief hope of striking outward, of carrying the war to its enemies, was finished. From here on, this would be a war of Paraguay defending itself, being pressed slowly back up its own rivers toward its own heartland, with the water that had always been its lifeline now turned into the road by which its enemies came for it. And then comes the long part, the grinding part, because knowing you are going to win a war in the end and actually winning it are two very different things, and the space between them is where most of the dying happens. The Allies had the men, the money, the ships, and the sea behind them, but to beat Paraguay, they had to push up the rivers into the country's fortified heart, and Paraguay had spent years turning that heart into a maze of trenches, guns, and swamp. The key to all of it was a fortress on the Paraguay River called Humaita, so strong, so well placed, its guns commanding a bend in the river, that people called it the Gibraltar of South America. As long as Humaita stood, the Allied ships could not simply steam up the river to the Paraguayan capital. The whole war, for years, would revolve around getting past it. First, the Allies had to cross into Paraguay proper, forcing their way over at a place called the Paso da Patria, the Pass of the Fatherland, and establishing themselves on Paraguayan soil. And then, in front of Humaita, in that flat, flooded, fever-ridden country of marsh and lagoon, the two armies settled in facing each other, and the war became a slow, bloody, muddy siege. And it is here, in this waterlogged ground, that the war produced its single most enormous battle. In May of 1866, at a place called Tuiuti, the Paraguayan army launched a massive attack on the Allied camp, and the result was the largest pitched battle ever fought in South America. The biggest single clash of armies this continent has ever seen. I am not going to walk you through the smoke of it hour by hour, because I do not tell you about battles to thrill you with them. The point is the cost. Tuiuti was an Allied victory, in the sense that the Paraguayan attack was thrown back with dreadful losses, but it settled nothing. The Allies could not simply follow it up and finish the war. Both sides bled, buried their dead, and stayed exactly where they were, staring at each other across the same ruined ground. That is the awful arithmetic of this middle stretch of the war. Thousands of men would die in a single day, and at the end of it the lines had barely moved. And then, a few months later, came the day that showed the other side of that arithmetic. The day it was the Allies who paid, and paid horribly. It was called Curupayti. In September of 1866, the Allies decided to storm a strong Paraguayan defensive position, a line of trenches and guns dug into the swampy ground. On paper it should have worked. They had the numbers. In reality, it was a catastrophe. The attackers had to cross open, sodden ground straight into the mouths of well-sighted cannon, and the Paraguayan defenders, dug in and waiting, cut them down. The assault failed utterly, and the Allies suffered terrible casualties for nothing. No ground gained. An army's confidence shattered in a single afternoon. Curupayti was one of the worst Allied defeats of the war, and it is worth pausing on for a reason beyond the horror of it. It broke the idea, still alive in some Allied minds, that this would be a short war, a quick lesson taught to an upstart. It made brutally clear that Paraguay, dug into its own ground and fighting for its life, was going to be extraordinarily hard to kill, and it deepened the grim mood on all sides. The sense that this thing, once started so lightly, had become a monster that no one could easily stop. After Curupayti, the Allied effort was reorganized, and command of the main Brazilian army passed to its greatest soldier of the age, a general remembered by his title, the Duke of Caxias, a careful, methodical man who is still honored in Brazil as the patron of its army. And under him the war became a patient, relentless squeezing. Not the reckless charge, but the slow tightening outflanking the great fortress, getting the ships past its guns, cutting it off from the country behind it. And slowly, terribly, it worked. In 1868, after years of siege, the Gibraltar of the South, the fortress of Humaita, finally fell. Its defenders had held to the very edge of the possible and beyond. And with Humaita gone, the road up the river to the Paraguayan capital lay open. By the end of 1868 and into 1869, the Allies took Asuncion itself. Now, understand what that means in almost any other war. The enemy capital has fallen. The great fortress is taken. The army that started the war has been beaten again and again and driven out of its own capital city. In almost any other war, this is the end. The defeated leader sues for peace, terms are signed, the guns fall silent. But this is not almost any other war, because Lopez would not stop. And here we come to the darkest chapter, the one that is hardest to teach and hardest to judge, and I am going to try to give it to you straight, with the sorrow it deserves, and without pretending I can settle for you what it means. With his capital taken and his cause, by any military logic, lost, Lopez refused to surrender. He fell back into the interior, into the hills and forests, and fought on. He turned it into what people would call the war to the death. And to keep fighting a war he could no longer win, he reached deeper and deeper into his own dwindling country for bodies to throw into it. This is the phase when the armies of Paraguay filled with the old and the very young, with boys, children really, sent into the line, sometimes, as I told you at the very start, with false beards charcoaled onto their faces to make them look like men from a distance. It is the phase of a whole society being fed into the fire, and it is also, and I will not hide this from you, the phase of Lopez turning on his own, a spiral of suspicion and paranoia in which he had people around him. Officials, officers, even members of his own family, accused of plotting and put to death. His country was dying around him, and he grew convinced he was surrounded by traitors, and the two things fed each other in a horrible downward turn. How you see this final phase is, honestly, the whole moral question of the war in miniature. One way of seeing it: here is a leader of such monstrous vanity that he would rather burn his entire nation to ash than admit defeat and save what was left of his people. A man who chose his own legend over the lives of the children he armed. Another way of seeing it: here is a leader and a people of such fierce refusal that they would not bow even when bowing was the only sane thing left, defending their soil to the last with a courage that is almost beyond understanding. I have read this both ways for 40 years, my friend, and I will tell you plainly, I think there is truth in both, and I do not think either one, said alone, is honest. Terrible vanity and terrible courage can wear the same face. That is one of the hardest lessons history teaches, and this war teaches it as harshly as any. It ended at last in March of 1870, in a remote spot in the northern hills called Cerro Cora, where the last remnant of Lopez's forces was finally run down. Lopez himself was killed there. The words history remembers him crying out that he was dying with his country may be exactly true, or may be part of the legend that grew up around him afterwards. You will hear them quoted as certain fact, and you should know that much of what surrounds his last moments is exactly the kind of story that hardens into legend whether or not it happened word for word. But the essential thing is not in dispute. The war was over. It had lasted more than 5 years, and what it left behind in the country that had started it is almost impossible to take in. because here is where I have to slow all the way down and be the most careful I have been all day, because this is the part that matters most and the part that people abuse most. Paraguay at the end of this war had suffered a demographic catastrophe with very few parallels in modern history. An enormous share of its people were simply gone, dead in battle, dead of disease and starvation, which in a long war kill far more than bullets ever do. And the loss fell most crushingly on the men. A country came out of that war with a population that was overwhelmingly women, children, and the old, because so large a part of a whole generation of its men had died. Now, here is my duty as your teacher, and I am going to do it plainly. You will very often hear a specific, shocking figure, that Paraguay lost more than half its entire population, some tellings say 60% or more, and that only a tiny remnant of adult men survived. And it may be close to true, but you must know that these numbers are genuinely, seriously disputed among honest historians, and for a very basic reason. Nobody knows for certain how many people Paraguay had before the war. The pre-war counts are shaky, and if you are not sure where you started, you cannot be sure how far you fell. Some scholars defend the very high figures. Others, the revisionists on this narrow point of demographics, argue the pre-war population was overstated and the true proportion lost, while still catastrophic, was somewhat lower. So here is the honest shape of it, and I would rather give you an honest shape than a false precise number. The loss was catastrophic. It was one of the most devastating population losses any nation has suffered in the modern era. A huge part of Paraguay's men did not come home, and the country was hollowed out for a generation. That much is not in doubt. The exact percentage, half, 60%, something less, is in doubt, and anyone who gives it to you as a hard, certain figure is telling you more than the evidence can bear. When the sources disagree, I tell you they disagree. That is the deal between us, and the peace was as hard as the treaty had promised. Paraguay was occupied by Allied forces for years afterward. It lost territory, carved off to Brazil and to Argentina, much as that leaked treaty had laid out. Its economy was in ruins, its fields untended, its independence, the very thing the war had supposedly been about on every side, badly compromised for a long time to come. A country that had been orderly and self-sufficient came out of this the poorest and most broken nation in the region, and stayed poor for generations. The war did not just kill a great mass of people. It broke the future of everyone who survived them. A student of mine, a serious, quiet girl named Beatriz, who did not speak much but who listened harder than anyone in the room, put up her hand once, right about here, and asked me the question I had been waiting years for a student to ask. "Professor," she said, "so who was the bad guy? Just tell us. Was it Lopez or was it Brazil?" And I remember I put down my chalk because I knew this was the real lesson, not the dates and the battles. And I said, "Beatriz, I am not going to tell you, and it is not because I am dodging you. It is because the honest answer is the whole point. Lopez started this war with his own aggression. He seized the ship. He invaded Mato Grosso. He declared war on a neutral Argentina and marched in. That is on him, and no amount of admiring his courage erases it. And the alliance that crushed him wrote itself a greedy, cold-blooded treaty carving up his country before the fighting was even done, and then prosecuted the war to a scale of death that went far, far beyond anything that could be called self-defense. That is on them. Both of those are true, Beatriz, at the same time, and if you can hold both of them in your head at once, without needing one of them to disappear so the story feels tidy, Then you are finally doing history instead of just cheering for a side." And she nodded slowly and wrote something down. I never did find out what, so let me gather this up because there is something in the story of this war that I want you to carry out of here, and it is bigger than Paraguay and bigger than Brazil. We measure wars usually by who won. And by that measure this is simple. The Triple Alliance won, Paraguay lost, Lopez is dead, the borders were redrawn. Close the book. But I want to teach you to measure a war a different way, not by who won, but by who is missing afterward. Because the truest picture of this war is not a map with new lines on it. It is a country of women. It is a village where the men are simply not there and will not be for a generation. It is the empty place at the table, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, in a nation small enough that everyone felt it. That is what the war actually was, underneath the battles and the treaties and the arguments, an enormous, nation-sized absence. And here is the part I want to turn toward you, wherever you are sitting. It is very easy, when we look back at a thing like this, to want a hero and a villain, to want to know which flag to wave. It is comfortable. But the honest reckoning with this war refuses to give you that comfort, and I think refusing it is exactly what makes you a grown-up about the past instead of a fan of it. A war can be, all at once, started by one man's aggression and prosecuted by his enemies with unforgivable cruelty. A leader can be, all at once, brave and vain, a defender and a destroyer. And the people who paid, the barefoot boy in the grass, his mother, the girl in the village with no men left to marry, they did not care in the slightest which historian was going to win the argument about them 100 years later. So the next time someone hands you a war, any war, tidied up into a story with a clear hero and a clear monster, I want you to remember Paraguay and ask the harder questions. Who is missing? Who is doing the counting, and what do they want you to feel? And is somebody offering you a nice clean villain so you will not look too closely at everyone else in the room? Because the moment a war becomes a simple story, someone is usually being let off the hook, and someone else is being forgotten entirely. Now I would truly love to hear from you on this one, more than usual, because this is a story that lives on how honestly we tell it. So come find me in the comments and tell me two things. First, honestly, before today, had you ever even heard of this war? Because it is the deadliest in the whole history of this continent, and most of the world has never heard a word about it, and I would love to know how far it has reached. And second, the one I really care about. Was Solano Lopez a tyrant who destroyed his own country, or a martyr who died defending it against empire? I have told you I do not think it is a clean answer, but I want to hear where you land, and why, and be kind to each other down there. Because good people can read this one very differently, and if this was worth your time, if you did not know that a small inland country once fought its three biggest neighbors at once, and very nearly ceased to exist doing it, then do me one small kindness and subscribe, because the history of my part of the world is full of enormous stories like this one, terrible and true and left out of everyone else's school books, and I mean to tell you every last one of them, as honestly as I know how. My name is Joaquim. Thank you for sitting with me through a hard one. And the next time someone offers you a war with a tidy hero and a tidy villain, think of a barefoot boy in the long grass, with a painted beard and a musket too big for him, and ask who is really missing from the story.